In the current day, there is no shortage of companies who are trying to resell you the same product over and over again. Disney recently released The Little Mermaid again. I think they're doing another one that I can't be bothered to even recall what it was, but just with people now for some reason. In the gaming world, this is very true as well. You have Oblivion, the remaster recently. You have a lot of Pokemon remasters and remakes. When you see a classic masterpiece be remade from the ground up, you would love to give it a perfect score. However, I can't do that knowing that it's a remake. And I want to talk about that. Welcome to the Platinum Review Service, B5PRS. Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles is a story-led isometric turn-based strategy game where you command 5 characters to battle. Now, gameplay generally does revolve around careful positioning and planning to keep your fellows alive and take down the enemy folk. The other side of the game is moving around a world map that fills up as you go to complete quests in taverns and shop for items. The game is a remake of Final Fantasy Tactics that was released in 1997 for the PlayStation, and again, it is a remake. They remade this from the ground up. It is not a remaster. They didn't just apply a fresh coat of paint. I wasn't alive in 1997 to judge the original, however, I want you to keep in mind that it is a remake for some of the things I'm going to talk about later. Graphics. Now, as a blind man, I think the graphics of the game are very fitting. I think they do a good job of conveying information to the player about what kind of enemy, tile, or item you're looking at. The visuals do stand out amongst generic fantasy titles since Final Fantasy Tactics does have that distinct fantasy that Final Fantasy games have. You've got your iconic black mages, white mages, chocobos, bombs, and a few other repeating cast members to kind of fill in the world. Furthermore, each job, weapon, monster, and etc., they do look distinct from each other. Now, my favorite part about the design is going to be the monsters. Monsters are all very dynamic and quote-unquote threatening, but I find them more cute. I would have liked to see a little bit more variety within each species because as it stands now, most species just get a recolor variations that barely do anything different. Luckily for the game, however, there is enough species to go around, so you'll probably encounter different monster species in different locations. Now, to go along with graphics is the sound design. Overall, I do like the sound of the game. I think the sound team cooked here, and you can tell that attacks that deal damage, they sound like they hurt. Spells have distinct sounds to emphasize what they do. Monsters, again, my favorite, have very nice sound. Stepping on different tiles have different stepping effects. It's very nice to see how reactive the sounds are to the state of the game, and this applies to the UI as well. Now, the original score is great. I love it. And to my knowledge, the remake didn't add any new music. However, I don't really think they needed to. Something the remake did do is add new voice acting. A little bit of a side note, but I did set my voice acting to Japanese, and then I never figured out how to change it back to English. But I think what I say here next applies to both, because the voice acting does help immerse the player inside the world. You can hear each character say a line whenever they're starting their turn, or whenever you start hearing someone chant and attack. I thought it was a really nice touch. Now, art side aside, I do want to talk a little bit about the gameplay. The overall game loop is going to be the story, then a battle, and then maybe some shopping or grinding, and then your rinse and repeat classic RPG formula, tried and true, and it is very well executed here. Battles tend to run a little long. They did add a beat up function to help you speed those along, but there's enough depth to each battle that so long as you keep enemy variety fresh, which they do, you can get a lot of different strategies and thinking and tactics that you have to perform to be able to succeed in the game. Now, unfortunately, battle goals and battle variety is a little lacking because most battles fall into the defeat all enemies category, and they did try to add more variations originally. Take, for instance, the protect this dude objective. Nothing really changes. You still have to beat up everybody, but now you just get to watch as one dude may potentially or may not throw the game at the very last minute or at the very start of the battle, and you have to restart over and over again to try to be able to continue. There's also the boss battles, which is the defeat this one dude objectives that do play slightly different since you can just power walk them and just target the guy. Now, I'm gonna say since 1997, there's been a couple games that do really good in the genre with battle variety. Probably crazy pull here, but Mario Rabbids Invasion I thought had really good battle variety. Now, to keep this kind of short, one of the battle types that you could do would be the escort missions. where instead of just protecting the dude, you'd have to escort, I think, Toad usually, to like an objective. And these fights have a pretty surprising amount of depth to them, with movement and defensive abilities to keep Toad alive and like help push him towards the objective. I know they also had extra challenge levels with additional requirements such as like turn limits, different enemies, or enemies spawning mid-fight. This adds a lot of difficulty without really relying on the numbers game, which loops back around to what I was talking about earlier. Admittedly, this is more of an issue with RPGs as a whole, but the numbers game is a little rough here in Final Fantasy Tactics, and this is somewhat of a personal preference because I don't really like when someone says a damage sponge is hard. I did play the game on normal difficulty, and some of the harder fights for me just tended to be different stats. Granted, some of the fights were actually hard because enemies like starting positions were wonky, or more enemies uses like of status effects. However, I would have loved to see a lot more of this, because as it stands now, poison, which is generally a staple in fantasy games, was kind of gone. You also had really cool effects like invisibility that were never used. You had like one dude use atheism on another dude, and it's like wild that they never did that again. Now, I do think another thing that made battles easier for me was that I had a pretty good understanding going into the game of like what kind of party I wanted to make. The game does allow every unit to have 2 different job commands, and this essentially allows them to multi-class into more practical roles. Like, for example, I had a gunner that could like throw items while disabling enemies. It's like a support core. Then I had a summoner that could cast most spells of the game, and then I had a vanguard that could jump enemies from like across the map. Now, this can lead to like correct party comps, but it's ultimately left to the player to optimize the fun out of the game. And there's plenty of like unoptimal, really fun classes in there, so you shouldn't really notice too much of like the game doesn't like push you into something that you don't want to do. Keeping in the theme of optimization, one of the things I did not care for was how easy it is to just grind your stats up. What I mean is that if you level up with like a good growth stat class, and then you de-level on a class that has really bad growth stat, you essentially keep the difference between growth stats, and that just allows you to infinitely scale a stat. And ultimately, again, this is player choice, but this could lead to scenarios where like level 50 characters are just one-tapping max level enemies. Keep this section kind of spoiler free. Outside of this main story battles, there's like 2.5 side quests, maybe some tavern quests that you'd like to do, but tavern quests are just menu simulators and like reading simulators. All they really consist of is like entering a tavern, just sending like 3 units every time, walking about the map a little bit, and then you'll come back to pick them up. You get a couple JP as a reward, and overall you really can't fail with these, so it's not really interesting. Now, when you compare this to the sequel, Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced, which released in 2003, the tavern quests of that game can require you to complete a few battles without the unit that you had sent. Tavern quests could also just be additional battles with their like own story and unique characters. They had a whole item system, which I don't really remember how it worked, but they redid a lot of like what they made this a lot more interactive. That's my point. In the spirit of comparison, another system that I think could have been improved by following the example of the second Tactics game would probably be the taming system. Now, I'm not saying that you had to add like a monster bank or anything, but as it stands now, you can really just tame monsters and send them to battle as mounts, but there's no real point to this since generic units are just so much objectively better than monsters. I think this game could have used something like blue mages or morphers from like Tactics Advanced, and then taming monsters would have a little bit of like a niche use. Poaching is useful in the early game to just getting rare items that you can't get from shops, but it isn't really worth having outside of that and the achievement, but I'll talk about that later, because most of like the good weapons are going to be treasures that you pick up off the ground, so there's no real point to poaching monsters on purpose unless you're trying to get a specific tool, and even then, there's better tools of the same class that you could just pick off the ground. Now, after the main game, there is one dungeon, and that is all the post-game. Without any like multiplayer support, which they did have in the War of the Lions version of Final Fantasy Tactics, I do think post-game content is a little lacking. I understand that the developers wanted to focus on the core game. However, if you're already remaking something, why wouldn't you try to address some of the systems that were clearly improved upon iterations? You've already improved the art, you've improved a lot of the game balance with JP adjustments, you've improved the UI obviously, you added a lot of quality of life features to make the game more accessible. However, you draw the line at adding content that's already been well received. I don't see why you wouldn't take the opportunity unless you're trying to sell it back to us later. Overall, the Platinum was okay. Most of what you need for the platinum, you'll probably just do naturally. There's like 2 achievements that are a little grindy. It's Master of all trades and the rare wares. I'd recommend doing these 2 after the main story ends so that you can enjoy the battle system without worrying about ruining the experience by being too overleveled. You can just auto battle the JP, like leave it up running for a couple minutes and then swap jobs and repeat, so it's not really too hard. It's more time consuming than anything. For rare wares, I know I bashed the systems already, but taming monsters just to get the eggs and then committing family slaughter is probably going to be your best bet. Now, you didn't hear this from me, but you can technically reload autosaves just to mess with the chances of getting rare poaches. Again, I didn't tell you this, but this also applies to stealing weapon chances and armor too. Just look up a guide to poach drops and just pick those out. All the job-specific trophies are pretty easy to get in a battle or 2, so you can just get them as you go if you'd like. I actually really like that they added job-specific trophies so that you have to use every single job. For missable trophies, it's just 1. Just recruit everybody and eventually you'll find it. It's not really too missable unless you don't recruit everybody. I do think the main strength of this game is how good the writing is. It touches on a lot of themes from political corruption, manipulation of history, classism and the injustice poor face from the rich. Compared to Tactics Advanced, I do like how much more mature the topics of discussion are. Ramza, the protagonist, goes through a very nice hero's journey. All the unique characters too are all very charming with their own motivations for joining Ramza in his quest or standing in his way. World building is very well done and thought out. If you ever have questions about anything, they added this whole menu that you can like read and like take your time to really immerse yourself in the world. Now, very great spoilers up ahead. I'll keep it short, skip to the next section if you'd like to avoid them. What I like most about the story is how Ramza and Delita start out at about the same point, but end up in completely different situations despite having like the same goal. Now Ramza, he's a gallant knight. He's dedicated to the people and goes on this huge quest to prevent essentially demons from taking over the region, and over the course of his journey he stayed true to his ideals and did his best faith effort to save everyone he could. In the end, he essentially ends up being a heretic and has to flee the country with his sister. Delita, on the other hand, he did not like the nobility, and nobody can blame him considering our current examples. However, the way he attained power was through betrayals and filling in power vacuums that Ramza leaves open. In the end, he does achieve everything he ever wanted, but got nothing he actually desired. Ophelia, the girl he liked, essentially couldn't trust him and try to kill him, and he had to just cut his losses. I think the story paints a really good picture of how different these two peoples are, and that this contrast ultimately stems from Ramza having the belief that everybody deserves the opportunity, while Delita believes that people are at most tools to use, ironically becoming the very people he swore to take down. Now overall, I really liked Final Fantasy Tactics: The Ivalice Chronicles. I think there are some things that could have been improved or that I didn't really like when comparing them to other more modern games. However, most of my complaints are really because I know that this is a remake and they had the opportunity to make it better than the original. I think the story is interesting and worth talking about. I do think the gameplay can be a little repetitive near the end game when you just have everything like optimized, but again, player choice. As a remake, they did do a lot to improve upon with like the autosave that I talked about, the lore explanations and details, but I do wish they would have added a little more. And that's my main complaint. I wanted more of this game. I felt like I played as something that is going to be sold back to me in a couple months. So let's hope that's not the case. That is my prediction. I think the Platinum Trophy isn't too hard to get, and I do think it's worth it. I think the game is worth that full price, but if you can get it at discount, even better. B5PRS out.